is joining me. We've been having a lot of conversations together about these matters of reflective practice. And I tried to describe MYFest, and it's impossible because what a wonderful group of people to come together, and an impossible to describe powerful community. And one of the ways that I've been very inspired by and shaped by is a seemingly small act. But of course, those of you that have a practice that involves breath or breathing, you know that this is a transformative act. And Alexis is just going to guide us through just a moment or two of some breath work. And I was very inspired by Rissa Sorensen Unruh, who did this at many MYFest community events in the past.
Sorry, Bonnie. The slides are sort of cut off. I'm not sure why.
Oh, weird.
Yeah, there, that's better.
Are they still not? It's so funny. I was trying to tuck it away off the side of my monitor, and how interesting that it doesn't, I mean, it makes sense to me now that it doesn't let you hide it off, because it doesn't want you to accidentally have something showing that shouldn't be, but thank you for calling that to my attention.
Sure.
I won't do that anymore. No tucking the slides away off to the side. I have one of those presenter view things, you know what I mean? So anyway, thank you. Alexis, I'll pass it over to you.
So Bonnie and I would like to invite you to take 1 minute of box breathing with us. If you don't wish to participate, that's fine. Just hang out for a minute. I will talk you through it. If anybody has done box breathing before, we're just going to do it in a series of 4 seconds for each stage. So just follow along with me, and we'll just do this for 1 minute. So go ahead and inhale and hold, 2, 3, 4, and exhale, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4, and inhale, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, and hold, 2, 3, 4. Now inhale, 2, 3, 4, and hold, 2, 3, 4, and now exhale, 2, 3, 4, and we're done.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, if you joined us.
Every time I do that, I go, why do I not do that more often? If any of you are interested in more of these reflective practices, I was so fortunate to be able to have 2 fairly recent conversations. Danielle de la Mar, the conversation was about fostering self-compassion, and what probably should have been expected to me, but was unexpected. She ends up guiding through a beautiful exercise in that particular episode. If you would like more of this, the episode links are on a resources page that we're about to share, but I'll put it in the chat just in case this is piquing your curiosity. Episode links at Teaching in Higher Ed always start with teachinginhighered.com/whatever the episode is. The second one I'll just mention briefly is Presence in the Online World. And these were 2 co-authors of a wonderful book by that same name. And just how wonderful to translate some of these more reflective practices, contemplative practices into online spaces. And it was just a beautiful book, beautiful conversation. I'd encourage people to take a look at that. For those I have not had a chance to meet yet, my name is Bonni Stachowiak. And I think what is unique to me in the higher education space is I've just had this incredible experience this last 10 years of being able to air an episode every single week. And yes, I am a person who is very motivated by streaks. Most of the time that's healthy. There are certainly some shadow sides to one's desire to hit streaks, but I can't even begin to tell you just the experience that has been to have these incredible conversations. I have been able to speak to people who were my heroes. I have been able to speak to people who were literally dying. I once on Twitter saw a man post an article that he had written called "On the Sociology of My Death." And I thought, well, that would be an interesting person to talk to. And he was, and when he passed away, we grieved. There have been other people who have passed away. Some of you I know these individuals who the world is still being able to benefit from their heart and mind and hands for teaching. So it's just been this incredible experience. My heart gets filled with gratitude. And right now I'm in a process, if you're curious, of starting to make some real plans to celebrate these 10 years. And if anyone wants to take a peek, I'll put it in the chat, let's see. This is not done. This is a draft. You're the first people that will see this, besides like a very small number of people, but we're going to be launching this website that's kind of going to allow people to share their stories. And we tried to come up with a name for it. Story Hunt was already taken, and I loved Story Hunt, but what we've decided on is Story Caravan. So we're going to be launching a Story Caravan in August for about a month, and a little bit of a chance to surface some even more of the stories of people teaching and learning from all over the world. So if you want to take a peek at that website, there's not a place right now yet. I have to build the form to sign up for the Story Caravan, but you can kind of see the emerging things that we're playing with there. And the other thing is that whenever I go to a session like this, I love MYFest. I love other conferences I get to be a part of, but I can tend to get a little bit overwhelmed, feeling like I can't keep this all. There's all this good stuff, but I want every quote. I want every book that they mention. It's both the strength of mine on the Strengths Finder instrument. It's called Input. And I love taking seemingly disparate information and making sense of it and sharing it with people. But it also, for those of you who may share that strength with me, it also can be kind of overwhelming because you want to collect it all. Like, digital space is cheap. I have 40,000 bookmarks, that I can search by tag, all the things. So if you're like that, or even if you're not, there is a dedicated resources page, and up to even 45 minutes ago, Alexis and I were adding to that resources page, and we certainly can continue to do that. So as you share, you already heard about my input strength. I'll be grabbing stuff and adding it to that resources page just so it can be a living, breathing collection. I love Jenny's talking about being a magpie. Oh, I have another talk that I give called Bird Brains. I have a feeling I'm going to have to incorporate magpies into future talks that I give. So I've shared a little bit about myself, and I'd love to have my co-presenter Alexis share a little bit about her as well.
So I like to use the word librarian for this tendency because it legitimizes it. So I am a former librarian. I teach, but now I teach at Indiana University in Bloomington in the United States. I am part of the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering. And I actually teach many of the social science courses for our informatics students. So I teach a course called Social Informatics. We look at the social implications of AI and algorithms. I teach an ethics course. I teach a information system design course. And then I also teach a technological nature course where we examine the complex relationships between technology and nature. I am thrilled to be here. In whatever capacity I can support this conversation, I will endeavor to do so. Bonni?
Wonderful. Yeah, and next week, the timing of this is rather remarkable since neither of us planned this, but next Thursday, so a week from today, an episode with Alexis comes out. And so that will be teachinginhighered.com/527. And we've just been in a wonderful, both correspondence, but also now that we know each other, having conversations about wanting to go beyond dichotomous thinking. And I always love when people listen to the podcast and then want to have conversations about things, because I don't consider each episode a separate thing. I consider it all a series of conversations. And so we've just been in wonderful conversations. I just got to pre-listen to the edited episode that will air next week. And I know it's just going to be one that I treasure, and I suspect ones that you will as well. Something I want to really root ourselves in is just this idea that we are never done. Whether we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion work that we might do, whether it's pursuing justice, whether it is pursuing putting more love, more wisdom out into the world, this is work that we do not practice with a destination in mind, because there is no destination. And that can be really challenging. I can be very hard on myself in my work, whether it relates to teaching and learning or other aspects of my life. And I suspect you probably can be too. I mentioned having had the great honor of speaking to people who have passed away throughout these last 10 years. And the ugliest cry that I made wasn't, though, about that news. The ugliest cry I made unexpectedly had to do with a very simple phrase that I didn't plan would evoke such emotion, but around course evaluations and just how raw that is. And I think to this day, that was probably 7 years ago. I think to this day, it may be more people emailed me. To hear someone do the ugly cry on a podcast really evoked a lot of empathy for people and kindness and care. And I will say, in one case, I felt anger, although words are clumsy on email, but someone seemed angry with me that I dare speak about the hurt that I had from evals because I had, quote, always had good evaluations, which of course that person did not know that about me, but and then, like, they just decided to assume that about me and be like, well, you don't really know what it's like to have bad evaluations. But I will also say I probably don't really know what it's like to have terrible, to really yearn to have edifying feedback and never get it is certainly not something I've struggled with, but it was just interesting to me, kind of the emotions that sparked up. So as I mentioned, we're going to be inviting people to go through various reflective practices today, and including one that I learned about from MYFest. So if you're not familiar with liberating structures is an overarching branch of various exercises, which, you guessed it, help to liberate us as individuals and also in collective ways. And so there's a wonderful resource from Maha and Mia that talks about this particular activity. And I was trying to grab the link. It's all in those notes, all in the resources page. But I'm going to invite you now to get a piece of paper if you've got one nearby, a nice little 8.5 by 11. I did hear that one of you has a journal that you're going to be writing in. That's wonderful too, because what we're about to do, not too difficult to do. I learned that this kind of folding, I learned this from my colleagues. I did not learn this from Maha and Mia, but my colleagues out here in California told me that this kind of folding is hot dog hamburger folding. So I guess, I don't know if this is a Californian thing or a working with kids thing, but of course the hot dog, you could fold it the long way if you've got a piece of paper with you, and the hamburger, you could fold it, and I should probably stop my sharing just briefly. You're gonna fold your hot dog, you're gonna fold your hamburger. So go ahead and do that now if you've got a piece of paper. And if you don't have a piece of paper, I trust you in your journal to be able to draw a line down the middle and to draw a line across the side. Jenny said she went to the same teacher training, the hot dog hamburger. Yeah, it was teachers who told me that. So maybe it's not California, maybe it is teacher training. So we're going to be going through the spiral journal in a fairly rapid pace. I would normally take more time with this and really reflect. Alexis and I have a lot we wanted to share. Let's just say that. So I would encourage you to even continue this reflective practice beyond the short time that we'll be spending on it today. So the first, if you don't have a writing implement with you, you could do this in your own mind's eye. You could be doing this in your mind's eye. You also could be doing it in a digital form, certainly. So the first thing that we're going to do is right there in the middle, for 30 seconds, we're going to draw a spiral. And you can see I'm a true artist. I mean, there has never been a better spiral than the model I've provided for you there. And I need to share my screen. Yes, I see the looks of, does she know that she's not sharing her screen? Okay, I'm back. All right, so in the middle there is a spiral, and I'm just going to invite you for 30 seconds in the middle of your page or in your own mind's eye to do your spiral. And they tell us the tighter it is, the better. The closer together our spiral can be, the better. Wonderful opportunity to just be present in this moment and to prepare our minds, our hearts, our hands to reflect. And our first reflection is my body is feeling. So in the upper left-hand corner, I would encourage you, you don't even need to write full sentences. Are there just words that come to mind, or is there an image that comes to mind for you? I'm going to give you about 30 seconds for my body is feeling. My body is feeling. And next up, we have a feedback related memory. All of the practices Alexis and I will be talking about could be applied to anything you receive feedback on. Yes, our examples will primarily be around teaching, but your feedback related memory may be from an entirely different context. Could be one that evokes good feelings, bad feelings, all sorts of feelings. So I'll give you 30 seconds to write a few words down or phrases about a feedback related memory.
Can you please explain it a bit again? Sorry.
Yes. So a memory that you have regarding some feedback or input that you got in some way. It could have come from course evaluations, from teaching evaluations, but it could have come from feedback about your cooking, or feedback input about your cooking, or input about any role that you might play in your life, some input that someone gave you. Does that help?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, thank you so much.
Sure. So the next question is somewhat related. We're receiving feedback all of the time. We're getting emails, we're getting text messages. We get some of us are on social media. We play all these different roles in our life where feedback, input, other people are saying things about something that we have done. When that kind of information starts coming my way, I am afraid that. So this would be some reflections on the fears that we sometimes can have when this kind of information comes at us. And finally, not all of us have a folder where we keep words of encouragement. If you do not, maybe you just write down, start an encouragement folder. We can do this in digital ways. We can have it the old-fashioned way in our desk file cabinet. But if you keep an encouragement folder, what's a gift that you know is tucked away in there? What's a gift? And again, if you don't have a folder like that, I encourage you to give yourself that gift. There are times when this work is incredibly challenging, and I don't know how I could sustain it without those gifts that are tucked away. To reiterate, that it can be difficult, at least for me. I was going through this practice just along with you. You start to dislodge some things inside. It's hard to remember why we're afraid. What is it we're so afraid of? By the way, the thing that I wrote down there, what am I afraid of? The recent example I have, that others will see it. I am a dean at my institution, but I also teach in one of our schools. And so we have a brand new dean in that school, and the thought of this person's first impressions of me and my teaching and what I'm capable of being as two-dimensional as our very poor course evaluations, they are not well designed. In fact, this entire coming year, we're going to burn them all down to the ground. So that's the happy news, is that I have a position where I have a lot of influence over those things, and I have power and privilege that can burn them all down, but we haven't burned them down yet. And that was what I wrote down, was I am afraid that others will see it. And then that somehow that reflects on the entirety of what I have to offer this world. So I'm sure that for me, as it brings up these very hard to confront emotions, I am sure that it does for you as well. And I just want to remind myself and keep reminding ourselves that we are becoming. I am becoming a person who is a beautiful, gentle way of treating ourselves as people who care about learning, care about growth, is to recognize that we will never be done. There is sometimes fear in that. And then when we can realize it as a practice and lived out values, there's real beauty and rawness in that as well. So I've learned so much from MYFest and from so much that gets modeled in this community. And one thing that got modeled for me a lot comes from Sarah E. Silverman. And if you're not familiar with Sarah E. Silverman, she talks a lot and writes a lot about disability. And she is a woman who is autistic. And one of the things that she does in her workshops is that every 25 to 30 minutes, she takes a break. And that is wonderful for people who are neurodiverse. It is wonderful for people who are not neurodiverse. And I do this now. We do this as a practice in the division that I lead. And it is so funny to me, because every single time we do it, you would have thought we invented breaks. And I mean, because we're people who tend to really get sustained and have long hours and hours of focused work. And we don't take the breaks very well. And then when we do it, we're so proud of ourselves. So wait until you see how proud that we can all be of ourselves when we take this quick 5-minute break. I am going to set a timer just because, as I mentioned, Alexis and I have a lot to share today, and that'll just kind of keep us all on track for keeping, making sure that we can live up to our commitment of the time together today. But I'm going to see you back in 5 minutes. I encourage you, if it's possible for you to step away. Maybe you want to do some more of the breathing, the box breathing that Alexis led us through. Maybe you need to go refresh the whatever beverage you might be consuming right now, if you're a caffeinated person, what have you. So I will see you back in 5 minutes. How to lead one, and a wonderful example of other people coming into community in similar ways. All right, welcome back. And for those who may have just joined us, let me put a link back to the This is all of the resources that Alexis and I planned on sharing, although if we, knowing the two of us, we may share something new. This can be a living, breathing place to go, where all of the slides are embedded and all of the books we talk about, the articles, and I'd love to add to it. So if you have things that you want to recommend today, that's my commitment to go back and update that after our time together. And if you would like to have, that has a link to the slide deck using beautiful.ai. But if you would prefer to have a version that has alt text, all of the alt text is there on a Google Docs slides. Google Slides, excuse me, but it's just not as pretty as beautiful.ai. So I'm living in both worlds. with this. So this is our planned agenda. I will tell you that the next break will not quite probably likely coincide exactly where it shows on this, because I'm more interested that we take the break at a time, you know, that makes sense versus arbitrarily fitting it there between 3 and 4. But know that we will take one more 5-minute break before we conclude today. And we've dislodged some feelings. And I will warn you that this next part is not the most cheerful part, because when we start talking about feedback, broadly speaking, it can certainly be challenging. And we are going to use many examples having to do with feedback in a classroom content. But as I mentioned earlier, so much of what we're going to share here applies across many, many different contexts. And so there's a danger of assumptions that get made, and we're going to be talking about some of the research around particular types of assumptions. And I mentioned my own fear that just came to my mind as we were doing that reflective exercise, that we can feel seen, but not in an accurate way. So it's not in a good way that we might have that feeling. Perhaps some might even say we have a feeling of being watched, or of being surveilled in some way, and in being surveilled in a way in which is not helpful or edifying to us. And I'm thinking of the work of people like Autumn Keynes. She started an entire social media and a collection on website just of surveillance that we may or may not notice if we're not paying attention in everyday society, and the amount of stress that that can bring on. And one article that I found was and this is by no means an attempt to disparage any institution. This kind of thing happens at, dare I say, many institutions, but a professor was secretly recorded and then terminated at an institution. And that's not a great feeling, where we can just imagine that something that we might say, something that we might do, could so easily be taken out of context. I do want to say I do not know a lot about this story. It wasn't really picked up by a lot of the press. And so this is, again, not meaning to be anything disparaging about UNC. What I am intending on saying here is that many of us have a fear of being watched, and that may not necessarily help us grow and develop as professors. My first job out of college was as a computer instructor. And I chuckled to myself as I think back to my 20-year-old self, 22 years old. I'm now 53 years old, so I've got many decades to look back on. And it was normal to me to be recorded. So my course evaluations at the time were what are many times called smile sheets. And when you hear smile sheets, what tends to come to mind for people is just this idea that you're rated on criteria that is fairly arbitrary. I'm sure if I had a researcher mind back then, if I knew the tools that I know today, there would be a lot of correlation between the likability of whoever was teaching, not actually anything resembling what was learned. And so it was fairly normal. If we were teaching at the building where they had classrooms at their facility, and especially if it was in your first 90 days of employment, we were recorded pretty regularly, and I would be handed a cassette tape. And then I could listen to that cassette tape in my car to and from. And it was really hard feedback. If any of you have ever videoed yourself teaching, or if you've done audio recordings, or if you have a podcast, for example, it's very hard, very, very hard to watch oneself and to listen to oneself. But to me, it was just very normal. That was a normal state of being, to be recorded in that way. And it was actually, in that way, the person I reported to, my manager at the time, he didn't listen to the tape. It was like for what it wasn't as terrifying as it might sound, because of the trust that he built up in me, in that I took it that he meant it, that this could help you. And by the way, it did help me. I do think now when I video myself or audio tape myself that it does help me. And so that same individual, one time, I mentioned being rated on smile sheets, that same individual, there were boxes, locked boxes in the front of each of those classrooms. And so they would come, the managers would come and take out the evaluations. They would sort of score them, and then, you know, what was your average rating for that day? And so then we would get handed back to us in our boxes. And I call this the sound of feedback, because there were two individuals. By the way, I did get very good evaluations. So I would be 10, 10, 9.98, 9.97, 10, 10, 10. I mean, this was a really addictive, not healthy way of looking at my effectiveness in the world. But that is the world that I lived in for that. I ended up working for that company, by the way, for 11 years. But that first year was all teaching, and then I moved into other types of roles there. But anyway, so one time I got an unusually low average for the day, and it was because two women who had sat all the way in the back on the side had given me straight ones, which I was very unsettled. I don't remember if I was crying in front of the manager. I don't think I was, but I was certainly saddened, feeling like I don't know what else I was supposed to do. These were just really rude people, you know? And so he asked me, he literally said, "Can you hold that in your hand?" He said, I want you to take those pieces of paper with the straight ones on them. Can you hold it like this in your hands? And my hands are palms open. Can you hold these things in your hand? Do they help you at all? Is this helpful information to you at all? And I said, no, that's not helpful information to me at all. And I'm trying to find something I can tear without this is dramatic. Okay, here we go. The sound of tearing is about to happen. So he said, no, it's not helpful. And he said, okay, here's what we're going to do with them. And he very dramatically teared them and then put them in the trash can. This was a man who followed the rules a lot and was very particular. And it felt like a revolution, the idea that you could hold feedback in your hand and you could decide whether it was helpful to you or not. And then you could decide what to do with it. Was really incredibly empowering at the time. And I still live with that memory. And in that same resources page, there is a link to a couple of different stories that talk about the bias that gets baked in to many of our systems for evaluation. And I have been having many conversations for this decade in airing these weekly podcasts about that bias. And we look at it from both a feelings standpoint. I mentioned that was my ugly cry on the episode, but we also look at it. Betsy Berry there was an episode where she spoke about the more conceptual research that has been done on course evaluations, and suffice to say there is a lot of bias that gets baked in there. So an alternative to this idea of only having one way of viewing our effectiveness, whether for me it was course evaluations back at my 22-year-old self, or for you perhaps some way that you might get rated in your particular role that you play. And so there's another option for us. And I first learned about this from an author, Stephen Brookfield. He's written over 30 books about teaching in higher education. And he introduced to me the idea of being a critically reflective teacher. And he writes that critically reflective teachers are on high alert for the presence of dominant ideology in educational institutions. And so I'm going to be sharing with you what he talks about as the assumptions that get built in to these dominant ideologies. But as we look at the slide I'm about to show you, I'm going to be asking you, what do you notice about it? I'm not going to go through every bullet. It's not going to be a long lecture about dominant ideologies. I want us to look at it more holistically. And what I'm really interested in is, what do you notice? What do you wonder as you go and view this next slide? So you can be typing in the chat if you would like to. And in fact, let me put in the prompt in case this is helpful to you. So as we look at these dominant ideologies, I'm going to inquire of you, and please feel free to respond in the chat. What do you notice about these assumptions as we share them, and what do you wonder about them? And as you might notice something, you could just put in the chat. You certainly don't have to put the hashtag, but you could include that if you want to be clear that you're noticing something, you're making an observation about something, or you are wondering, often form, some type of a question. So from Stephen Brookfield's book, Becoming a Critically Reflective Teacher, here are some of the assumptions that he talks about get made when we hold dominant ideologies. And these are things that show up across societies and cultures all over the world, although in this book, he does speak of examples within the United States. That is where he is based, although he is originally from the United Kingdom. So he talks about capitalism as an assumption that we build into our systems and structures, positivism, and again, assuming that there is just one way of knowing, and that's a scientific way of knowing. Democracy, that majority votes are the best way of always making decisions. Militarism, and again, his example here specific to the US, but that the US must be the strongest and the toughest and the best to assure dominance. He talks about white supremacy. And if you're interested in this, by the way, he did an entire episode with me about this very thing. Assumes that this dominant ideology assumes that white people are seen as intellectually and logically superior. And therefore, this dominant ideology assumes they should hold the power. And patriarchy, of course, very similar, but instead of white men, assuming that men should lead. So I'd like to invite you now to share what it is that you notice and wonder, and please feel free to just take a minute to do that in the chat, and then we'll kind of discuss what we see. Go back to that slide so we don't. What do you notice and what do you wonder as you look at this list of the assumptions that get made? Yeah, and we should say that these are just 6, but there are many more. And Alexis has pointed out another dominant ideology having to do with technology in her comment. Thank you for these rich comments. In preparing for our time today, I went back and reread many portions of Stephen Brookfield's Becoming a Critically Reflective Teacher. It is beautifully written, very powerful. I can't even do it justice in the small little bits I'll be sharing today, but it's a wonderful resource if you'd like to deepen your critical reflective practice. I can't think of really a better place to go in that strict pursuit of that aim. Heather, so good. I imagine some of you may be typing, so please feel free to keep sharing there. I'm going to introduce to us just one other paradigm from Stephen Brookfield's work, so please feel free to continue. But I'm just going to introduce this second one, and that is the idea of hegemony. And this is the process by which an existing order secures the consent of people to the legitimacy of that order, even when it disadvantages them greatly. And this is something that I see often in my own teaching, specifically as it is students who discuss politics with me. It is a very curious thing for me that I sometimes have a hard time understanding. I do not teach politics, by the way, but I happen to believe that politics is all around us, whether or not we teach in that formal discipline or not. And so this idea of self-reinforcing dominant ideologies and power structures being present. So here are just some of the hegemonic assumptions, and I'm going to invite you to continue. You're noticing and you're wondering. I think every one of these I could relate to at different stages in my teaching. Oh my gosh. So here's the first one that Stephen Brookfield talks about, and that's all about it's our charisma. And so it assumes that teaching relies on charisma in order to make a difference. And he really is critical of teaching awards and the way that they get structured in a lot of our universities, that they really should be called charisma awards and not actual teaching awards. And then finally, oh gosh, this one, it's under control. It's under control. That is for me, that especially as we start talking about wanting to do justice in our work, wanting to provide equitable teaching to our students, inclusive teaching, boy, things can sure feel out of control, and isn't learning out of control. Student resistance is another thing that comes up in these hegemonic assumptions, where that we need to eliminate it. You know, how dare them resist things? You know, that's not, you know, something they should be doing as part of their learning. And philosophers and thinkers such as Paulo Freire would argue differently, that in fact resistance is a really good, healthy, in fact revolutionary kind of way of seeing the learning process. I already mentioned the perfect 10 myth. If you don't see that in the lower right hand corner and harken back to being graded practically every single day of my life on a 1 to 10 scale, and at a very young age, clinging to that as such a sense of self-worth. Boy, was that ever baked into me very early, and still to this day. I mentioned 30 decades more later. What did I write down when I was journaling? I'm afraid someone else will see my course evaluations who's new to our institution and will think that that is the whole of my teaching. By the way, I didn't even get bad course evaluations. They're just not very meaningful. I was just like, that's not like who I am as a teacher. It's not meaningful data to have. Complex challenges. We live in a world of complexity, and we sometimes treat it like it's cause and effect. And finally, something that I suspect will be relatable to so many of you, the lone hero problem, that we can fix any of these issues by ourselves just as individuals, as opposed to looking at the systemic roots. Alexis, I'm going to ask for your help. Do you have an example of what hegemony is, or hegemonic assumptions? Can you give us a definition of it? And I can go back to a slide if you need me to.
Yeah, let's go back to the slide.
Yeah.
And that was not the question I thought you were going to ask me.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So sorry. Yeah.
No.
And Jenny's answered it in the chat too, so we might look at that too. Yeah.
Let's see.
So we've got a question, what is hegemonic? And Jenny says, sort of like the dominant state or the dominant voice. It's often used to describe politics and other institutional stuff.
So one example is one that my students often raise. So this is an argument that my students make. And in one of my courses where I'm trying to encourage them to think maybe differently, right? In that facial recognition technologies keep us safe, right? And that the idea of safety and security is used to legitimize these systems, even when there are very serious and negative consequences in many instances in different contexts for different groups, right? So my students will be like, but we've got to keep everybody safe. And so that constant narrative of and reinforcement of these systems will keep us safe, right, overrides the concerns and disadvantages that we know exist with facial recognition systems. Does that help?
Yeah, that was helpful to me, just as an example where, don't we all want to be more safe? Don't we all want to be more secure? Values that are fairly universal, but then it looked at a deeper level might be in contrary to other values that we hold, but get covered up in that simplistic look. Yeah, that
Right.
was
And
really
then
helpful.
and sort of handing over the definition of safety and security. So we're hearing a lot at the moment about AI safety. And in my ethics course this past spring semester, one of my very astute students said, but how are they defining safety? And I was like, that's a great question. And who is defining that safety, right? And so we have a lot of tech companies and a lot of talking heads saying, but we're working on AI safety, but that's a very specific type of safety and overlooks these other types of concerns that other people are raising whose voices are getting drowned out.
Thank you, Alexis. All right, anyone want to share any other assumptions that come up for you beyond these 6, or did any really resonate with you? When you look at this list, have any of you, like me, fallen into the trap of the perfect 10 myth, where we're supposed to be perfect in our evaluations? Or have any of you fallen into feeling like racism is entirely on your shoulders, and that instead of really knowing that we're part of communities and systems that might work in solidarity with each other, do any of these really stand out as ones that resonate, or any that you'd like to add to this list? Because there are certainly many others. Allison Scott, we need to measure learning engagement and teaching effectiveness to prove our worth. But many research-focused colleagues assume teaching and learning can't be measured. For example, it's just an art.
I think in academia getting sorry.
Oh no, please go.
I think in academia getting published a lot is is supposed to be good, but there are many problems.
Yes, absolutely. Manisha, did you want to share?
Yes,
Yeah.
I just find it so fascinating, all these sessions, and it's so good what you're presenting. Never thought of it that we are, as an instructor in a First Nations college on the reserve, and I'm from India. I'm not First Nations or Indigenous definition of Canada. So hegemonic becomes very good. And I think it is Indigenous superiority, like white supremacy, Indigenous supremacy, because I've worked with an organization where I am the only non-First Nation. I also think I'm trying to understand more hegemony. I've heard this word 100 times. What exactly is it? So I like your examples. And let people watch. And I think we're always being watched. Like we have 24 cameras in this place. And I loved you started the conversation, how somebody may misinterpret what you're saying and can be used against you. So then how do we communicate? Like, should I just shut up my mouth, see no evil, hear no evil, say no evil, so that I will have a job and I can pay my bills? And if I'm modeling that, stereotyping or no action, don't rock my boat, then what am I doing with my values and my ethics and the students I'm teaching? Because it is all about activism and healing. When I'm working with the Indigenous college, all courses, I think, must have a component. This is, again, not being arrogant, but healing, because it is trauma. Like it is constant 24/7 trauma my students are facing. So our work at every point, I believe in two things. One is open education and activism, like healing, activism, advocacy, building alliances, because we have to work together. It's solidarity. And why does culture become so complicated in doing things? Even in Orga 2500, which is a human resource management, one of our assignment is, how would you do behavioral change from someone in a different culture? And I'm co-teaching it with the president. So already the hegemony, I have to be down. Even though been, because of power. See the discomfort. And I raise my children always saying, be comfortable in discomfort. And what's more interesting is they give the sentence to me every day. They tell me the sentence. It's not just raising your children, it's a way of life. What I'm saying is, why are we always being watched? Like, why are we wasting our time, life, when we can watch ourselves with the reflective practice? Because we all want to do a good job. And thinking of place, like how I am placed, a person from India in Canada, here on the reserve. And when I will say indigenous supremacy, indigenous hegemony, people will laugh at me, because when you think of indigenous, it's always oppression is what you think of. We think of white supremacy always. But in my context, I'm marginalized and I'm a minority,
Thank you for so much for these. Yeah, thank you so much for these rich stories and examples. I love the way that you're layering in top and making it more real in your context and help describing that. As you were sharing your examples and the struggle that you are feeling, that I thought, I don't want to oversimplify it, but how do we do it? Well, we don't do it alone. We do it in communities together like this with people who are quite different from each other, but who share these deeply rooted values and who can question one another in safe places to sharpen the ideas and to sharpen the impact. And we do that. And you mentioned the word solidarity, which is just resonates so much with me. We are going to take our second of our 2 breaks, and looking forward to you getting a chance to refresh, maybe move back away from your monitor, and I'll see you back here in 5 minutes. Okay, see you in just a few. Welcome back, everyone. Apparently, if you have not noticed this about me already, I have no sense of time. If I ever did, I lost it in early 2020. You can't imagine what would have happened. I'm so glad that we're back from our break. I do so enjoy the examples that people have set for the importance of taking those breaks. I did a little bit of stretching during mine. I hope that you were able to get away from your monitor a bit. Yes, time did break in 2020. We're living in alternative universes. All right, so that last part was so powerful. Thank you to those who shared in the chat. Thank you to those who shared aloud. Thank you to those who didn't even share, but just who are reflecting on some of these tensions in your own mind and as you think about your values and your practice. So from here on out, Alexis, all we have is cheerful stuff, I say sarcastically, but what we have are some practical things. So now what do we do about this? We've looked at some of the problems. We've looked at just the devastating thing that it is to believe something and then have systems and structures that we may or may not even recognize are present, attempting to retain their dominance. So what do we do? How do we build our awareness? How do we build our action? And how do we do that through reflective practices? So how can we, with things that are ever changing, Alexis is going to be sharing a bit about how artificial intelligence may even help us do this and how it won't help us do it. So like looking at it from multiple perspectives, what it can and cannot do, and how can we really be able to see. And one of the things that has come up so often since 2020, although I suspect it's been there really forever and a day, but it was just this idea of just doing things, oversimplifying it. There was this meme that kept coming up early in 2020 of it was just do it, and someone being asked to play every instrument in a band. He had the drums going up here, he had a backpack with a saxophone in it, he had all the things, and it's just like, just do it. And it can feel impossible because it is impossible. And sometimes those impossibilities are by design. So we want to resist against this just do it. And this idea of reducing teaching and learning down to very simplistic ways of seeing. So Stephen Brookfield offers to us 4 lenses of critical reflection. And so we've been talking a lot about students' eyes. I gave you a few examples earlier. He says that you can understand that students can reveal surprising insights that significantly challenge our assumptions and beliefs. So yes, we absolutely should listen to students. Their perspectives are vital. And one thing that I have been particularly benefiting from recently is this tension, though. Ask students for information that they actually are equipped to give you. And when Jody Green was on the podcast, she gave the example, do not ask an undergraduate student to rate a professor on how qualified they are in their discipline. That's not a good type of feedback to give students, but we also shouldn't never ask students anything. So students provide us with a lens to be able to see critically our own teaching. Our colleagues can be helpful to us. And I'm a really big fan of an organizational behavior author by the name of Peter Block. And Peter Block talks about mapping even our lives out in terms of our organizational political relationships. And he has what he calls allies. Allies are our friends, or if you're me, the person that you're married to, who are always going to be on your side. They're always going to be, you're amazing, you're incredible, you know, that you're absolutely biggest supporter. But Peter Block talks about, and yet you can't get everything that you need to see from your greatest supporter. That sometimes someone who you trust, but who can give you more critical feedback, can be incredibly valuable. So the idea of colleagues who we grow up enough trust that we can have those conversations. And this came up with Manisha earlier. We don't want to only rely on the more external kinds of ways of knowing. Our personal experiences matter. They should inform our teaching. That we should also think about our own lives when we get disengaged, for example. Too many times when faculty, oh, students today, they're so disengaged. Have you reflected on when you yourself get disengaged? Notice and wonder about your own self. And Stephen Brookfield makes a joke in his book about faculty meetings. Have you ever felt disengaged in a faculty meeting? What might you notice and wonder about that feeling that might inform your own teaching? And then, yes, how wonderful. And someone said this earlier in the chat, teaching is not only an art, although I would say it is an art, but it can also be a science, and there's so much richness that we can learn from the theory and from the research. So that is a little look at other lenses that we can use, and that's from Stephen Brookfield. He really talks about, when it comes to the student lens, knowing how your students experience learning, and I love this phrase. So you can build bridges that take them from where they are to a new destination. And I certainly don't mean to parse words with Stephen, who is not here to defend himself. But when I read phrases like this, I also think like we're going together to a new destination, and I need to challenge myself often where I had never planned to go. Can be really helpful. A lens that Stephen Brookfield does not mention, but I have found incredibly helpful, are called observation protocols. I mentioned to you about my cassette tape that I used to be able to listen to myself, teaching back when I was 22 years old, driving back and forth to work. That was a form of an observational protocol, except for the protocol was just really mushy. All I could hear were the voices in my head of, why do you keep saying that? Very negative, self-deprecating voices. Observation protocols bring the observation part, which can be, to learn to watch oneself, to learn to listen to oneself, to learn to observe oneself in your mind's eye is a powerful skill. But these protocols help us be able to do this in somewhat of a more objective manner. Now, is it perfectly objective? I would not argue that, but far more objective than my self-deprecating voice going in my head. So a very recent observation protocol that I have learned about through Tracy Addy's work, as well as her co-authors in a book. The book's title is just on the next slide and on the resources page, but she introduces the protocol for advancing inclusive teaching efforts. So they went through a lot of qualitative research, and they asked students about their experiences of learning, and they have been able to identify 15 observable behaviors and skills that might occur in our teaching. And I'll give you an example of some of them. So this could, by the way, I'm mentioning in a traditional classroom space, but these same types of observations can be done on Zoom. These same types of observations could be done in an asynchronous class with some tweaking for sure. But here are some of her 15 inclusive practices. This is Tracy, Derek, and Dr. Mitchell in Enhancing Inclusive Instruction, Perspectives and Practical Approaches for Advancing Equity in Higher Education. So let's just look at a couple of examples. Was it observable at all in this 45 minutes or this hour that prior knowledge was assessed for diverse visuals or media? In videos that were shown or articles or simulations, were diverse individuals and ideas and ways of thinking represented? Couple other examples. Did the professor ever use words of encouragement to validate student contributions? Here's a seemingly small one, but we know it can change so much. Did the professor ever use students' names? Did the professor ever offer students the opportunity to choose between different activities? So they have an entire website for their protocol. It's fairly new, as I said, because it's based on all this qualitative research that they did, but you can go get all the training that you need to be able to do it. There's some videos that you can watch that teach you. There's some case studies where you watch a video and then you practice using this protocol to observe a class so that you can create some kind of inter-rater reliability for our statisticians out there. And then they have these Excel spreadsheets. If you take a look at the slide here, you can see on the first slide, that is someone who is using a lot of one type of engagement and not a fuller breadth of them. So maybe someone with less experience using some of these inclusive practices. The one in the middle, someone who is using more of these 15 different measurable things you might observe in a classroom. And then the one on the right is someone who uses a lot more that are more relational practices. So this is the protocol for advancing teaching efforts. This is not intended to be a full training on it, but I can tell you, you go over to the website, which is linked to in the resources page, and they have really thought of everything as far as it's all laid out for you. They have the training that you can go through, and this is all freely available. You could start using this in your own teaching or for those that you work with. And I mentioned just how difficult this can be, how incredibly challenging this work can be. I mentioned my own emotions, and I suspect we all have stories of just how challenging this can be. And in recent weeks and months, maybe, I've just started to think. So I continue to learn and grow as it relates to artificial intelligence. I served as the scholar in residence at the University of Michigan, Dearborn, this last fall, all around artificial intelligence in higher education. So having lots of conversations for the podcast, lots of conversations through that experience. And I started to wonder if you could use AI to shave off some of these things. And I'll give you an example. Okay. So I was reading someone else's course evaluations. I mentioned that I'm a dean, and so yes, I do read other people's course evaluations. And there was rather colorful language being used in one of this individual's course evaluations. And I thought, well, that's really not going to be helpful, even if there is a problem here. I wonder what AI would do with just someone spewing out all of the curse words you could possibly imagine in a very short order. What would it do with that information? And I started to experiment, only to discover, which surprises no one, but only to discover there are a lot of people doing the same thing and a lot of people asking the same questions. And Alexis is going to talk to us now a little bit about her experience at their university and how, yes, indeed, my early question of, could you use AI to shave some of this stuff off? The answer is yes. And so she's going to talk to us a little bit about the role AI might be able to play.
So first off, this is Alexis. I am not an expert in this either. I started experimenting with this, in fact, last semester, precisely for the reasons that Bonnie's laid out. How could I navigate sometimes some really cruel course evaluation comments? Because I wanted to understand student experiences, but I also didn't want to subject myself to, you know, the fact that I am the worst human being ever on the planet and that I had no business being in the classroom, right? Like all in all caps, right? From students or whatever they might say. So I was like, could AI help me out here? I certainly have trusted colleagues who I could turn to. We have a lovely Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning, and they have consultants who will sit down and do this work with you as well. But, you know, we're all tired and crabby at the end of a semester. We may not have time. And do we want to just process this maybe a little bit on our own before we reach out, right? And so I did a bit of an experiment. So this is just a quick overview of some of the things that I learned as I was doing this. First, be sure to check with your institution that you're allowed to do this. A lot of institutions are putting in procedures and processes around generative AI and the work of students. They may or may not consider student evaluations, whatever you call them at your institution, to be student work, but I would definitely encourage you to check with your institution. They also might have a preferred generative AI provider that they would like you to use. We have one. I don't use it. I think it's terrible. But for my institution, as long as I make sure the data is anonymous, it's not a big deal. So cleaning the data, I think this is going to look different for all of you in terms of how you receive student evaluation data. We can get ours as an Excel spreadsheet. We can download it. And while that information is anonymous, students are not always good at keeping it anonymous because they sometimes out themselves in their comments, especially if it's a small class. So I teach classes anywhere from about 20 to 300. And so in my smaller classes, I'll be reading them like, oh, I know who that is, right? Like it's really easy for me to connect the dots because they out themselves. The other thing they don't do is they'll often call you by your name or sometimes less polite names, right? So one of the things I would suggest you do is remove your own name from it, depending on your own relationship with generative AI. I started using Professor X as my, instead of just found my name anywhere it was mentioned and just did a find, replace all and put Professor X, right? Just so that it was a generic name. I also took out the course name or course numbers, those kinds of things. And again, if students outed themselves or other students, I've had a couple of times, it's not common, but students would complain about another student in the class doing XYZ that I didn't stop or whatever. So just clean that data. What's nice is if you do that, it's a bit of a pain to start with, but you can save that data then in a spreadsheet. And I've got mine over time. So now I can actually track changes over time, right? Like how have I improved? And then the next piece of it, so you've got a body of data maybe for one course. You've got to figure out what you're going to ask generative AI to do it. Bonni, can we go to the next slide with the prompts? So you could literally do a really simple prompt, say, analyze the following responses from student surveys that asked, what did you like about this course, right? You could literally leave it at that. And you could do it for each of your questions, depending on the types of qualitative questions that your institution asks students to complete. We also have the opposite of this question of what did you dislike about this course? That's a delightful one to read, right? You can combine the data and ask the AI, like, analyze this for likes and dislikes. It can sort of give you the themes and the trends in the data, which can be really hard to see when you latch on, at least I find I latch on to that one negative comment and it doesn't matter what anybody else has said, right? All I can see is that one negative one. The AI can sort of look beyond that and put it into context of all the other comments, right? But you can get a little bit more specific as well with generative AI. So depending on your purpose, and I think this is really important to think about, is what are you hoping to gain from this information, right? Like, how are you going to use it? Is it for a promotion portfolio that you have to put together? Is it so you can actively make changes to your course? What are you most interested in? So I included a couple of other prompts that you, Bonni, went, thank you, that you might think about. So how did you make your classroom a space where students felt empowered to contribute to class discussions? Is there anything in that qualitative data that you've cleaned and you've submitted to AI that it can pick up that would intimate one way or another that students felt comfortable to talk in the class, right? You can get really complex with your prompts. You can tell it you're an expert universal design for learning practitioner, right? And like to analyze these responses in the context of that, or one of the universal design for learning principles. You can say, hey, look for principle this, and tell it what it is in these comments. So you can get as simple or as complex as you want. You can try this with different generative AI tools. You will get different results from different tools. There are some that I liked in terms of its output versus others. Some just crashed and burned because they couldn't handle it. But really focus on the information and the questions that are most meaningful to you, and how might you want the course to change based on that information, right? In terms of what you're going to get back from generative AI. Generative AI, I would say this is not the solution to all of this, right? We need to remember those other three lenses that we've talked about in terms of like, this is one window into student experiences, but remember that does it align with what you're also seeing in reflective, right? Generative AI is predictive. It doesn't actually know what's going on in your classroom. So it's predicting based on its understanding of language. It sometimes will give you strange responses. So use information from all those other lenses to collaborate and go, you know, sort of corroborate what is it that it's telling you. And if you're like, that doesn't make any sense, right? Like question a little bit further and go, oh, maybe it did it this way, right? Or it's misinterpreting this comment, or it's made up information, which we know generative AI can sometimes do. Bonni, can we go to the next slide? Oh, I guess maybe. So does it make sense? Does it align what you hear from students in other contexts, from colleagues, and your own reflections, right? Like those other three lenses of critical reflection. I'm quickly going to check the chat because I see a bunch of messages that come in.
Oh, it was me. I'm typing what you said. I was reinforcing what you said. Yeah.
Is that great?
Yeah, Christina said that was such an interesting use of AI. I thought so as well. And I've really been enjoying experimenting. And in fact, Alexis had already come on to be interviewed for the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast, but she heard me mention in another episode, just a sentence, literally, and she goes, oh, did you know that we're doing this? That's the whole reason she's here today, was because I was like, yeah, I'd love to have you if you could join us in the conversation. So thank you so much for that. And I know there's so much more that Alexis could share around this, but let us both end with some reflections on hope in action and just really trying to build in what we were sharing about earlier about really it's comes through solidarity. So how can we do this work? Well, we do it together and we allow ourselves to be seen in trusted spaces to be able to do the kind of growth and development. And it's so important. Manisha asked this earlier, how do we do this? How do we do this? I believe we do this by remembering that we are not alone. How wonderful to get together with this group of you to have these conversations today. And I mean, so many other conversations in MYFest. We are not alone. We don't do this work alone. And I wanted to share just a little bit of a clip of a video. And it comes from, I mean, this video comes from more than just this book, but I am learning about birds. I mentioned earlier that I give a talk now called Bird Brains, really a fun talk to give. So people know that I'm now interested in birds. I'm quite the novice, and so they tell me things about birds. And a wonderful book called The Genius of Birds comes from Jennifer Ackerman. And she describes something, and some of you may have seen this before, but let me just show it to you. And I want you to think about what you notice and wonder as you watch this. Just take a look at this, either if you've seen it before or if you've never seen this before, just take a look and think about what you notice.
Bonnie, I don't know if it's just me, but I'm just seeing a still image.
Oh, okay.
Not playing.
Well, that's not very helpful. Thank you for letting me know.
There we go.
How about
That's
that?
better. Yes.
Christina, that's twice that's happened now on my presenter view. I was seeing it perfectly and you're not seeing anything. Yeah. You're like, what I notice is nothing's happening. All right. Those of you who know what this is, go ahead and type in the chat. What is it that we are seeing together? If you've ever seen this, what do we call this? This thing. Phenomenon. That's the word I'm looking for. Yes, this is known as murmuration. And if you've not seen, I'm used to like geese. Geese, they fly in formation, right? That is the strength and weakness of my teaching, right? It's the geese flying in formation. This is a lot more representative of what teaching and learning looks like. Although it looks like utter chaos, behind the scenes, there are actually some things that are happening. So this is called murmuration. It's synchronized movement and collective intelligence that gets observed in different kinds of birds, although often flocks of starlings. So that was an example of it. So Jennifer Ackerman talks about each bird is interacting with up to 7 close neighbors. And Allison's saying she's not seeing the screen share. Are you seeing it, Christina, still, the screen share? Yeah, Allison, I think it might be you, but yeah, it might be on your
I'm
end.
not sure how that can happen.
I'll just try one more time, Allison, in case this helps. I'll try resharing if that helps you, but otherwise it might be on your end. Each bird is interacting with up to 7 close neighbors. So it looks like chaos, right? But I think about solidarity, and we think about the ways in which we can work together in small communities like the one we're in today. Jennifer Ackerman continues, making individual movement decisions based on maintaining velocity and distance from fellow flock members and copying how sharply a neighbor turns. Listen to this, a group of 400 birds can veer in another direction in a little over a half of a second. And so they do this for solidarity, they do it for warmth and information exchange, and they do these smaller clusters for optimal group dynamics. And Mahabali, who's normally able to join us, she's at a friend's wedding today, but she's written an article that I linked to in the resources where she describes this as a kind of distributed and decentralized care. And isn't it beautiful to get to witness that together? And so we asked the question, how do we do this? Well, coming together and cultivating our imaginations together. Ruha Benjamin writes in her recently released Imagination, a Manifesto, and she says, remember to imagine and craft the words you cannot live without, just as you dismantle the ones you cannot live within. Many, many books if you want to explore some of these topics further, particularly around the ethics and the use of technology. Alexis touched on a few of them, but there are many more resources that you can go and learn more about. And one recently released book by my friend and colleague Ludmila Kraslova, her book is called The Canary Code, A Guide to Neurodiversity, Equity, and Intersectional Belonging at Work. And she tells the story about the Canary Code, which some of you may have heard of the Canary Code. It's not a myth. It's not a literary device. It's a literal thing. So back in the United Kingdom in the 20th century, they used to literally employ canary birds. And I've heard this before. I suspect many of you have as well. I made the assumption that the birds were sacrificed. I thought this did not end well for the birds. And I'm sure in many cases it did not. But I didn't know until her book, they actually used canary resuscitation devices. I mean, how marvelous is that? So they don't use them anymore, but in her work, Ludmila talks about people who are neurodiverse being able to be that canary and to warn people for systems and structures that are not equitable and how important it is for us to listen to them. And she writes, sensitive does not mean broken. It means processing the experience more fully and intensely, just like birds process the air, the oxygen, and the pollutants more fully. And I am watching the clock. I know that we are to our end point. If you are able to stay for a couple of minutes, I welcome you to do so. I just have a quick poem. It won't take me more than 2 minutes to read. But for some of you that need to sign off, I just want to officially say thank you so much for being here. What a treasure this has been. I will be reflecting on this experience for many days and weeks to come. And so for those of you who can stick around an extra 2 minutes, allow me my time of poetry with you as we reflect one final time about this idea of I'm becoming someone who. This is a poem by Mary Oliver called Wild Geese. It is one of my favorites. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert, repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about your despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Thanks for being here, everybody. If you are able to type in the chat just one hope-filled action that you are thinking about doing as a result of today, we would love to hear that, but recognize many of you may have to take off. But if anyone has time to share a hope-filled action, we would certainly love to see it. Do it. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Jenny. Thanks for taking the time. Love it, Meg.
I have started reading poetry to my students.
Oh, I'd love to learn more about some of the things you're reading to them. Thanks, Jenny. Mur, thank you. Oh, so important. Self-gentleness, being gentle with ourselves. Yeah. Yeah. Jenny, I missed that one. I need to go back and. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. So grateful for being in community with you today.
Thank you so much, Bonni and Alexis. Really appreciate this session. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone for joining us.
So I stopped the recording.
Yes.